and colleagues. Good evening to you in Africa and Europe. Greetings wherever you're joining us for this webinar. On behalf of the Council for World Mission, I greet and welcome you. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. As we warmly welcome all of you in tonight's webinar, we have posed a couple of poll questions on your screen, which we are kindly asking that you answer for us. We are delighted that you're with us this evening for the second of 3 eDARE webinars for the Africa and Europe region, in which we reflect on the challenges and opportunities of the COVID-19 pandemic for the way we live, work, think, communicate, worship, and do theology. As one of our colleagues said in our earlier session today, how do we do theology with a moving virus? Alongside climate change, racism, sexism, and other isms of our time, the COVID-19 pandemic reflects more than our contextual realities. It exposes lies, widening inequalities, blatant necropolitics, the ways of life-denying agents, and much more. These webinars aim to help us think, reflect, and most importantly, to reimagine how we might navigate our unprepared, unhealthy, and uncaring societies. I am delighted that we have this evening with us 3 colleagues who will help us to think about how to respond to COVID-19 from within church communities, as well as doing so being interpreters and critics of the culture in which they are located. Anna Kasafi Perkins is from the University of the West Indies, Mona, and St. Michael's Theological College, Kingston, Jamaica. James Perkinson is Professor of Social Ethics, Ecumenical Theological College, and Lecturer in Communication Studies, Oakland University, USA. Miguel Algranti is with the Department of Anthropology, the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, Universidad de Buenos Aires, Argentina. Before we hear from our panel, however, I would like to invite the Reverend Dr. Peter Crutchley, Mission Secretary, Mission Development, to bring greetings on behalf of the Council for World Mission.
Greetings, friends and colleagues. It's a great privilege to come and share in this event and to greet you all on behalf of Council for World Mission, and to speak both to those who are contributing and those who are listening and attending and sharing in this moment and in the challenges we're trying to unpack and explore together. Council for World Mission is an organization that is committed to what mission and theology can do together when they are brought together in creative dialogue and analysis. And when these things happen, CWM can see that new worlds are possible and can begin. Our own history is about an organization that began at the end of a century in the midst of a pandemic of uprising, upheaval, and crisis in Europe in 1795. And they imagined a world transformed by Christ. This vision has continued, but we also know from our story that this vision gets lost, and the new world that becomes possible in our imagination and vision and passion can become distorted and stunted. And those millennial hopes turn swiftly into the vision of a world shaped by particular realities and particular interests, and the occupation of particular bodies and lands for the benefit of the white communities that sent these missionaries through our organization. So we know that it's possible when mission and theology come together, that it's not a new world that's imagined, but an old world enforced. So we are curious and excited at the prospect of our critical commentators challenging us, speaking into this reality, to ask whose realities are we reflecting on? Whose new world are we imagining? And that through the work of these scholars and our work together, inspired by it and by the work of those amongst us and listening here today, a new world is made possible because of the challenge that COVID is bringing. So greetings, friends. It's a joy to be with you, and I look forward and anticipate all that we will share. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll move to our panelists. Our panelists would have 8 to 10 minutes to speak, and they would go in the following order. So we'll have Anna first, and we like to highlight that Anna has recorded her piece. She's here with us, but she has recorded her piece. And to alert you that you may need to turn up your own volume on your gadget because it was recorded in a very light voice. And followed by, after Anna, we would have James Perkinson's paper, and then Miguel would bring the discussion among the, or the contribution from the panelists to an end, after which we'll open our discussion, and the discussion would start from among the panelists, and then those who are also accompanying the panelists listening in, and then we shall receive questions from those of us who are in attendance. So I'd like to turn to our first presentation from Anna Perkins, and the title of our paper is "We Put Off This Mortal Coil, the Body in COVID."
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. The title of my presentation is taken from a letter to the editor of the Jamaica Observer newspaper, in which someone called George Garwood assures us that in putting off our mortal coil, we would soon return to our eternal home, heaven. So Garwood penned this meditation on mortality, eternal life, and the afterlife in response to the deadliness of the COVID pandemic, which, like most pandemics, engenders deeper philosophical and religious reflections. So what he does is that he attempts to provide a word of hope with a type of cosmic theology that moves beyond the very mortal coil, which I consider to be, and when I talk about mortal coil, I'm talking about the body and its attendant afflictions and sufferings, and then ultimately death. I juxtapose his letter to a poem entitled Collage that was done by St. Lucian poet John Robert Lee, and John's one of my absolute favorite Caribbean poets. And this is a part of what John says. He asks, who would think that pestilence is ravaging our world? No safe zone on continent or island. Familiar routines locked down, family, friends, lovers masked and distance, networks obsessed with flattening curves and death statistics, churches and mosques closed except for fanatics, beaches, bars, brothels shut except for the skeptics, or those who want normal here and now. And there are us who must crowd long lines outside shops. Who wrote the script? Who configured this incredible dystopia? Judgment is dropping abroad from our mouths and our hands. What unbelievable drama is rolling out behind the scenes? Who is moving, Ephesians, to the center stage of this cosmic scenario? Just so beautiful, so profound. I really thank John Robert Lee for giving me the opportunity to reflect on and just to eat up the beauty of his words. Now, I don't believe that John Robert Lee takes the same stance that Garwood does, because I don't think he stands back from the concreteness of this mortal coil. He doesn't want to quickly escape from it, you know. So he works with the concreteness of empty brothels or shut churches, even as he faces the pandemic's cosmic, dystopian, and eschatological import. In fact, I think he draws my attention when he asks the question, what is moving center stage? When he asks that question, for me, he draws my attention to the body. You know, his concreteness centers our mortal coil on bodies and how they're treated in the Caribbean, a region which is born out of and deeply marked by inequalities that exclude and marginalize and deeply, deeply reject. So when we look at the virus and what the virus is doing, we can talk about it attacking not only individual physical bodies, but also communal bodies, racialized bodies, gendered bodies, poor bodies. And look, it does so disproportionately. And in doing so, it exploits and deepens these existing fault lines that I've already identified. So simultaneously, in our response to the pandemic, what I also see are the deeper attitude that we have towards the body. Those attitudes that we have are made clear by how we treat the body in the pandemic. And so what I see in that are implied theologies of the body, which shape the way society treats the body. And in the Caribbean, Christianity has been a shaper, an important shaper of theologies of the body, as well as a means of socialization into how to treat the body. I find Christianity having an ambiguous impact, as it both subordinates the body while it also empowers the body and presents the body as a site of creativity and justice even. Now, the body question is important for me as an African-descended, Jamaican-born, Roman Catholic woman theologian. Bodies like mine have been continually devalued and misrepresented by political, religious systems. So when I look at COVID and I ask questions of the body, I dare to question the meaning of the body as it has been laid bare or even made barer by the pandemic. And so what I'm doing is I'm quickly pointing out some situations from the Caribbean where the pandemic and how we treat bodies indicates the value that has been given to bodies. And I'm specifically thinking about certain kind of working bodies, bodies that have been framed as loose, and, believe it or not, dead bodies. And I don't by any means want to suggest that those three situations exhaust the challenge that COVID-19 poses to us on the meaning of the body, but it simply serves to highlight the complexities of the situation that we're dealing with. So why don't we begin at the end with dead bodies, yeah? And dead bodies are bodies that make us uncomfortable because these bodies have shuffled off their mortal coil and are the ultimate expression of our mortality. Different societies have different protocols for how they're going to treat the dead from the pandemic, and most tend to want to treat the dead in a way that sees them as being contaminating. Therefore, they have to protect the living from the dead. So in many cases, these emergency situations, you find that dead bodies are no longer considered to be sacred, no longer treated with the kind of respect that they would have been in the past. And so on the contrary, they're even seen as a source of worry or fear by the government and also by many people. The fear and worry that attends dead bodies during pandemic, I think, is also compounded by the fact that cultural and religious rituals for preparing and sending the deceased off on a journey to the afterlife while allowing the living to grieve and to celebrate have been curtailed and been distant during the pandemic. More troubling for me, however, is the rejection of dead bodies. Dead bodies are no longer respected but feared and fearsome. And in Jamaica, initially, some funeral homes actually refused to accept and prepare them for burial. Further compounding the grief of families, many of whom would already have been stigmatized and shunned from their communities to begin with. Many people have been threatened and felt threatened and been forced to leave communities because of the fear that COVID engenders. So let's go on to working bodies. What about working bodies? Innumerable Caribbean people have lost their jobs and livelihoods due to the pandemic. Among the most affected, to my mind, are migrant workers. And they ply their trade both inside and outside of the region. There's quite a migrant trade inside the Caribbean among the Anglophone Caribbean islands. But many more migrant workers undertake farm work in North America under seasonal agricultural workers programs, and they're often designated as essential workers, yet they're generally not covered by national health schemes. All right, loose bodies. Now, the material experiences of sex workers during COVID is another site for reflection and interrogation. Sex workers are already involved in an industry which is fraught with danger, moral opprobrium, and discrimination. and they're portrayed as loose, they're immoral, they're criminal, they're vectors of disease, and some of them are considered to be, many if not all, victims of trafficking. With COVID, of course, there's been a curtailment of the sex trade, especially with the lockdown and curfews, and they're left unprotected, increasingly vulnerable and unable to care for themselves and their families. So what conclusions and considerations can we come to? I think attention needs to be drawn to the inequalities that disproportionately affect bodies that are desacralized, criminalized, marginalized, and that live in financially precarious situations, often outside of systems of respect, health, and social protection. However, living in a pandemic does not change the fundamental duty we have to respect and care for others and for ourselves. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that the vulnerable and disadvantaged farm worker should not bear harm more than anyone else for the benefit of the larger community. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that the deceased deserve to be treated with respect and that their loved ones be afforded new and safe opportunities to mourn and celebrate. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that sex workers be recognized as full members of the society and be afforded respect and protection in keeping with their human dignity. Furthermore, the impact of COVID-19 on these bodies, I believe, highlights vulnerability as a moral concept, which requires some further exploration. When we talk about vulnerability, vulnerability captures the capriciousness of the human condition, or something, like the concept of moral luck. But it also refers to a state of being which is created and intensified by unjust social conditions. By recognizing this distinction, we can discriminate between the vulnerability that we experience as human beings, vulnerability to suffering that is caused by the virus on the one hand, and the particular injustice that groups like sex workers, migrant workers, deceased persons, and others face during the pandemic on the other. The true meaning of vulnerability to our mortal coil bears further and deeper exploration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think we're going to now move to our second presentation, which is from Jim, and his paper is entitled Coronavirus Cacophony, When the Dwarf Rebukes the Giants. So over to you now, Jim, while we reflect on what Anna's presentation and now listen to yours.
So, SARS-CoV-2 is a messenger. Unseen by us, it began somewhere in the wild as a mysterious particle, neither living nor non-living, riding bat wings. But now it has become a power with a capital P. How might such be so is the subject of this writing. Under viral tutelage, we are made witnesses today to an angel, in biblical terms, falling right in front of our eyes. And its falling is essentially a matter of prodigality, of ballooning to unimaginable dimensions. But to see such, we need guidance. And here I turn to Walter Wink's work on powers and principalities as fallen angels, infesting all of our bureaucracies and institutions, some of which he will delineate as elemental spirits associated with natural forces exercising influence and pressure on human action and experience. The thought experiment I'm offering here tracks the recent advent of the virus as just such a natural element. Part of the winged world of bats for who knows how long a stretch of time, suddenly finding opportunistic opening to work its magic and searching for a new arrangement among a whole new constituency. But stating my purpose such is already problematic for many of us. Most modern, especially westernized humans are hardly predisposed to perceive the little COVID strand under this magus emblem. We are much more likely to pillory the DNA pirate under war images. Yet such may well have been its role in evolution, and indeed even up through this contemporary moment as part of the continual search of the mysterious thrust of life for adaptive resilience across the microbiome of the planet. There's some thought that the virodome, long before Genesis time, may have kickstarted biodiversity on Earth by trading RNA for nutrient proteins from the double helix of life, wherever it could find trading partners. The result has been continuous transfer of genetic material between hosts, complements of these tiny invaders. But this viral quest for exchange may then beg recognition as an ancestral impetus for what we have yet to achieve socially in this country. Here we may be stumbling upon the original multicultural genius orchestrating biochemical difference into fiercely interdependent mutuality. The conductor was a virus. And in consequence, each of us as a human realization of this primal flux and flex now hosts some 380 trillion viral riders on our journey. We are hardly individuals, but rather living, walking ecosystems, symbiotically breakdancing with all the other ecosystems of our given geographical surrounds by way of microbial communication and interaction. And the coronavirus is then, at one level, simply one tiny appearance of a shared ancestral inheritance on constant mission to provoke and adapt to novelty. But as conduits of diversity and provocateurs of novelty, viruses do not only infect, they can also reveal. Most immediately, what they reveal today is systemic vulnerability. It would seem part of the tricksterism of wild nature that such a dwarf being could upend a global economy. What seemed unassailable has now trembled. But said more precisely, what the corona novelty's recent parousia has most cogently revealed is monstrosity. It has hardly skipped across the world stage with equal impunity. Rather, having leapt the strait of sequestration between winged cave populations and human concentrations in urban quarters, the virus is found retooling as a power, or perhaps more accurately, given its appellation as a coronavirus, a principality, since ironically, these were typically depicted in Christian angel art as crown bearing. It gains aim and focus as a weaponized consequence of our social stratification and political violence. And here, Paul's inventory of titanic hierarchy offers food for thought. His litany of principalities and powers, thrones and dominions, heavenly authorities and world rulers brought itinerary and organization and scale to the task of deciphering and confronting the spiritual interiority of Roman might. Though an antique language, this ancient conceit can also open questions for our own struggle to grasp COVID as not merely disease enemy to be defeated by medical intervention, but simultaneously spirit omen from the other side, demanding hearing. To wit, the realm of the powers in the biblical corpus is hardly a central articulation, but rather shows up as a mere hint that glowers from behind the veil of apocalypse at odd moments when the mask is knocked off center. If we pay close attention to what we read, we find a peculiar caveat when it comes to spiritual combat against organized political power engaged by Jesus or his followers. Demons may be sent packing in their daily interaction with various individuals, but the large-scale powers are typically not exorcised in the send-up of the text. They are only constrained. Mark will have Jesus advert only to binding the strong man when he looks down the road to his temple action, clearing out the money changers, not actually exorcising that particular power. In view is a kind of restraint or retying, a constriction setting a limit. That this is also the basic meaning of religion, as literally a religaturing or binding up again, will be deeply suggestive for what I'm teasing out here. Indeed, if we have so far departed from what in indigenous practice is merely the sum and substance of gift economy living, continually recognizing ritually and feeding in kind the entirety of the created order that itself continually feeds and provides for us, then there may well be need consciously to name and keep foursquare in view the practice of retying the powers. Religion in its most primal meaning. Indigenous communities had have no need to engage in specifically religious activity because they never untied the powers in the first place. And here lies a whole world of difference. But we should go slow by listening to Luke for a stretch. Here I advert to Jesus when he's challenged about the power by which he casts out demons. He instantly begins mulling over the spiritual character of large-scale political institutions, such as kingdoms like Herod's or houses like that of David, now incarnate in the Jerusalem temple state complex controlling land debt and tax tithes. Then delineates an imagined struggle between a strong man and one stronger. The former's goods will remain intact unless he's subjected to constraint or bound. But if the latter overcomes the former by taking away his armor, then indeed his palace treasure may be disaggregated, the spoil divided, the defenses dismantled, not destroyed, in order to redistribute his stash. Which is to say, spiritual combat at the level of principalities and powers is primarily a struggle over scale. At issue is the size and architecture and aim of a given stockpile of goods. The imagined remedy is primarily a matter of decomposition and redeployment, not obliteration. We can elaborate. Kingdoms, houses, nation states, temple complexes, etc., are effectively assemblages of materials coercively ripped from natural habitat that never entirely lose their spiritual potency or sacred aura, even when removed from the symbiotic systems of wild reciprocity in which they originally came to be and reconfigured to serve in and as unnatural systems of human domination. They carry continually a charge of spirit. But that spiritual undercurrent accompanying their material aspect now thrashes in hungry captivity. Whether cut tree, mined metal, piped water, stripped leaf, skinned animal hide, or carved rock, all the accoutrements of imperial utility amassed and reshaped as palaces and chariots, ships and weaponry, or today in my country as White Houses and Pentagons, computer and missile guidance systems, planes and bombs, or as the armature of transnational corporations, or the anatomy of mega cities, etc. All of these are, from a more indigenous perspective, living creatures now enslaved. And they remain spiritually forceful, but no longer embedded in an eco-mutuality scaled to the kind of flourishing characteristic of biodiversity. Like human beings dispensed by violence and not properly grieved, the natural materials, sorry, I lost my place here. The natural materials of urban architecture and imperial infrastructure alike are effectively homeless elements out of niche bodies, raging in spirit as hungry ghosts. And the need then is to return the powers to a more local scale of operating, not use them up and discard them in fictional states called garbage, but recover their eco-being in a relation of community and sustainability where everything, including ourselves, can be recycled in imaginable perpetuity in gift economy circulation. So perhaps a virus can teach. Mediator in the deep past, on quite successful mission of provoking biodiversity, messenger of the outback of late, warning of trespass on the part of a species careening towards self-destruction in overlord hubris, made functionally an oppressive power in its immediate captivity to our policy routines of race and class inequity. This not quite living one might yet be embraced as spirit if we were to entertain its advent as omen. What it signals may be this: religion in its most primal meaning of going back downscale and little, relearning again how to live like indigenous ancestors and exemplars within bounds and binds, seeing an entire planet of unfathomable complexity and inimitable beauty as the real heaven of destiny and the real ravager and consort of our desires, demanding respect and reciprocal embrace. It really is enough. There is no absolute unbinding promised anyone or anything. but only liberation into a sustainable give and take where everything limits and binds everything else in mutuality. And within that compass, the Corona Queen of our hour might even provoke us into becoming a novel co-dweller on Earth in a biodiverse exchange with all else never quite anticipated before now. SARS-CoV-2 is indeed an elementary angel. Whether her message is finally good news or apocalypse is up to us.
Are you finished there, Jim? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, for your contribution. And I'll now move to Miguel. Miguel, it's your time for your presentation.
Well, hello, everyone. My presentation is going to be unscripted, so please hang with me. The main ideas that I'm looking forward to expand and develop in this piece of paper are three. The first one is under the idea of pandemic, no? The etymological root of pandemic, the word pandemos for everyone. And I think there's a universality there that we could actually mirror with the universality of Christianity, and that it's pretty much confusing in the terms that if COVID-19, it's been democratic to expand, but deeply class-based when it comes to counting death. So the fact that it's for everyone, it's not only a biological statement of the speed of contagion, but a question that must be asked: who is this everyone, and how is this death socially distributed? That's one of the aims. The other aim is the observation that I have from participating in previous eDAREs, that this pandemic is articulating and enhancing three dystopian scenarios which were recorded and debated in previous eDARE conferences. The first one is the idea of the Anthropocene. That's the age where human beings are capable of transforming the environment and bringing on massive extinctions that obviously include the extinction of human itself. The other one is what in previous eDAREs were talked in media streams. That's the idea, the impact of new technologies, not only in religion or in theology, but also in the role of new technologies in the emergence of authoritarian leaderships as Bolsonaro or Trump, to name a couple. And the last one, it has to be with this authoritarian or far-right turn we're experiencing in the world. So my response or the structure I wanted to give to the piece to this work is the idea that comes from my anthropological sensibilities to think of this pandemic as a ritual of passage. And what do I mean with this? Ritual of passage in anthropology, it's one of the theoretical tools we have that have this universality. Every culture has these rites of passage, funerals, as Anna talked, and weddings, but also coming of age kind of passage. And the sociological observation about this kind of rituals are the special relationship between the social structures and symbology. Every ritual of passage has three phases, have a structure of their own with three phases. The first phase is separation, where the subjects of the rituals are taken away from the cultural marks and symbols that bind them to a specific social structure. In the first time there's a displacement, they took them and they put it in the neophytes are going to a hut in the middle of the forest, away from the village. And they also strip away the marks, the clothes, the paintings that could identify that subject with a special social structure. After that, the second phase, and the most important here, because it's the one where theorists of structuralism look for change, is the Luminar Phase, which I think is the most recognizable phase we are living on. And it's the phase when we're not what we used to be, and we're not yet what we're going to be. It's a place of transition, a place of ambiguity, usually marked with symbols of both genders, for example, of ambiguity itself. This is a moment of a lot of potential. This is a moment where socially, it's the moment where our structures allowed for change and allow for communities, for non-hierarchical communities. And in that liminal phase, we have a lot of what Anna was talking about, the idea of purity and contamination, which also comes with this biological part of the virus. No? The idea that the people who are no longer classified by culture, it's dangerous and it's contagious. And in other words, it's structurally invisible. So I think the liminal phase of the rites of passage is the more prominent feature that we are all experiencing. That's a place where the pandemic, the universality implied, it's in full action, because we already have this separation. We are locked down. We were stripped from our journeys and circulation and from the displacement. For example, for anthropologists, missionaries, or theologians, displacement is a very important thing. It's the way we do theology or anthropology. We need to, and we're taken away, we're locked down in our houses. And the last part, the last phase of a rite of passage is the idea of aggregation. It's where the neophytes get the new symbols and structures that is going to compose that new era, that new phase, and that comes with a special form of communication. And here I'm also reflecting in what James said about religion as religare, no? Of communication, also religar in Spanish is to bind together. And the way rites of passage usually go, it's that the communication and the reflection called the neophytes to reflect upon their society by presenting the structures of the societies in a monstrous way. And we are actually seeing a lot of this in 2020. No? We've seen the full force of the inequalities in every social structure we can look. We have what I wanted to call the racialization of class. That means that race and class are coming together. We're always together, but now it's exposed. Poor people are black people, are brown people in all America, and those are the people who are dying most. The second thing about this moment of communication, I think this is the most important thing I can in my input for a forum of missionaries and theologians, is that apart from reflection, apart from critical thinking, apart from intellectual, the founding stone of the new era, of the new, I don't want to say normality, but of change, it's often what anthropologist Victor Turner called an irrational symbol. That means a symbol that is not linked to a critical theory, I think, or to a web of meaning, but a symbol that is the pillar stone of a new network of meaning. And that symbol, it's not only irrational, like in a bad way to criticize like irrational, but in a sensuous way. What I'm trying to say is that in South America, for example, we have in the past a lot of social movement around, for example, liberation theology. And one thing that anthropologists can assure from the remnants of that movement is that they got too much intellectualized. They forget that there's a feeling alive part of God, of the religious experience. And if you want to move from, if you want to do a liberation theology, you need to engage the people also in that more sensuous, bodily, if you want, sense of God. Because you can be critical as one or analytical, but the thing about the experiential part of religion is that it's more democratic, that it creates a language which is more democratic for people to join. You don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to read Bruno Latour to understand it. So my idea is that in the reflection we're doing now, we are looking for that irrational symbol, to that cornerstone of the new normality. And I want to criticize also the idea of normality. I think the change we are looking forward, we are looking forward with hopes and with fears. With fears, it's everything we've been discussing today. The idea of more authoritarian, the idea of biopower going forward, of technology entering our everyday life, and more control and far-right movements as we're seeing. But there are also hope we can see in this process. You have Chile a few days ago voting for changing the constitution of previous state by Pinochet. You have Argentina also getting loose of Macri, and now there's a big movement of taking lands also in Argentina. And you have Bolivia going away from a dictatorship. So my idea here, my main idea for the coming back to the work, the paper, was to make a comparison between a coming of age right of the Sernan people, an indigenous people of the south of Argentina, analyzing what I recently exposed here, the social structure with the pandemic. I think we don't have to jump to conclusions right now. It's a moment for reflections, and there's a moment we have to take, or not only reflecting, but also in silence, to see what's happening. And one of the main things that recently, when I was hearing James talk, that came to me, was the idea of we have to go back the essentialization of religion. This essentialization goes from thinking that religions are some kind of ethereal spirituality, and we have to go back the separation between what we call secularity and religious. Because what we're seeing is an economy of objectified commodities that are carrying the crystallized stones of our social inequalities, and a religion of ethereal kind of reflections. So my idea is that we have to move to a more imbricated ways of thinking and moving, where the technical and the religious would be much more confused in much more dialogue than we are now. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. That's a brilliant pulling together, while your own distinctive contribution, pulling together and making connections with Anna, with James, and your own presentation. We are now entering into a discussion on your presentation. And I think that I heard from James, trickster. I heard from you, liminality. I heard also from Anna, the kind of what comes from the religious tradition as the response that comes from religious tradition, representing and reflecting deeper attitudes, a kind of liminal attitudes perhaps to bodies, some of it positive and some of it negative. And this whole idea of discovering the new, in terms of what new we need to have now, an irrational symbol playing with religion, pandemos, I think is a good space in terms of us to have now from among the three of you, the kind of connecting links your contributions are making, as we do not bring closure to what is before us, but we are wrestling with what new we need to engage with. So I would want to invite us now, invite the three of you to reflect on what you have heard from each other. What are the connecting bits? What are the challenging bits? Where are bits that you need to think further on? I think also, Anna, that in terms of a Caribbean perspective, when Miguel was talking about liminal space and James hinted in a slant with the tricksterism, there's also the bit from Caribbean in terms of bodies and limbonality, how the bodies move in different spaces that are oppressive, but it's not just a show, it is also rediscovering the new. So let's have your thoughts now from what you've heard from each other. Who would like to begin? Hannah?
Yeah. Wow. All I can say is wow. I mean, the presentations are just so rich and open up so many things. I'll start off with Miguel, just to be troublesome and follow on your trickster thing. Mike, I was reading something this morning about Halloween. Today's Halloween, and they were asking about what could be the popular Halloween costumes this year. And the suggestion is that, well, more than likely they're going to be things like toilet paper and sanitizer, you know? And I thought to myself, why not the coronavirus, you know? So listening to Miguel questioning what our soon to be irrational symbol could be makes me wonder where a symbol such as this virus, which, taking it back to Jim's presentation, this virus, which really is simply a messenger, depending on how you look at it, or an omen, which really captures in itself the kind of interdependent mutuality that's at the heart of creation, human creation, the creation of the world, that there's a radical mutuality and a radical interdependence that's there that we haven't sufficiently taken account of, and what the virus is doing. And, you know, both Jim and Miguel were pointing that out, and it tied in very nicely with my own concern about the different fault lines that exist, and how the virus just simply comes in and exploits those fault lines, but also exacerbates what's going on there. So Jim's pointing out to the monstrous nature of it, and Jim's use of Walter Wink's language and so on is actually quite stunning. It really brings me back to what good stuff Walter Wink is doing, and just how talk of angels and demons and monstrosities of that kind makes sense in context such as our own in the Caribbean, where we give expression to those kinds of powers and practices and processes in you know, our duppies and our Laja blesses and all of those kinds of things take account of those experiences that we have to find, those monstrous experiences that we have to find a way of capturing. And, you know, that's just one way of doing it. So I found that quite fascinating, those kinds of connections. And then to hear from Jim too, this whole question of religion as rebinding, and that's not about destruction. And that's what also hit me too. The perspective that what religion ought to do is to rebind, which also involves redistribution. Therefore, there's not a destruction. Even that which is seen to be damaging is calling us to some kind of neutrality. And it does not involve a destruction of what we see as being problematic or damaging. So there's something there that we need to think about. And I wonder from Miguel's presentation too, can we get stuck in liminality? You've pointed out the 3 stages, and that we get to abrogation where there are new symbols and new structures and so on. But can we get stuck in a kind of eternal liminality? And is it possible to say that where we are with Corona now is a kind of eternal liminality, because we're not yet finding that irrational symbol that's going to help to pull us together in some kind of new way of communicating a new way of crafting or creating structures. I'll stop right there for the moment.
All right, I'll go on and weigh in, although I don't have anything coherent really to say. Imagine a white man not having anything coherent to say. But the trickster idea that Michael pulled out, one of the things that we've had to deal with in Detroit is I've been involved in a now 6-year movement to try to halt water shutoffs to poor Black and brown families in particular, as part of the financialization of Detroit, where structural adjustment came home from the global South and really began to be implemented here in a new way. And Detroit was a kind of laboratory. And in 6 years of struggle, we were trying to get an affordability plan passed where water bills would be correlated with income, and just couldn't get anywhere. And then COVID accomplished it within less than a month. So as a political actor, with all of its damage, it also managed to achieve for the short term a goal we've been fighting for 6 years. So a real kind of trickster presence. What Anna is pointing to with embodiment, I think, is crucial and ongoing. And for me, learning about my white embodiment from people of color, particularly Black folk, for more than 30 years, and more recently with my Filipino wife, last 20 years trying to listen especially to indigenous folk and their ways of being embodied by the land and the ecosystem right where they are. So more and more as a Christian, I want to push on our prioritizing human embodiment as the major thing we think about and act on, and begin to ask deeper questions about a broader sacrality that I think COVID also raises for us. And in the middle of all that, those are kind of big questions of the hour for me, given what's going on at every level with climate change, corporate extractivism, the battle of nation states, et cetera. The big question for me anymore is sustainability in place. And at the same time, what I hear in Anna's presentation is, the need to really attend to who's suffering right now. And that for me is absolutely crucial as well. And I don't have easy answers. I've been involved in a couple moments in activism in the streets in Detroit, particularly Black Lives Matter. But most of the younger people there saying to those of us who are older, just stay out of the hospital. Don't take up a hospital bed. Stay back. This is our time to be active. You can contribute other ways. And that's been both a gift and a hardship, as I'm used to being out in the mix. What Miguel is talking about, I think the question of pandemic is a deep question, pandemos, affecting everyone, which certainly gets channeled in neoliberal globalization and parsed out according to race and class and gender and global north, global south kinds of divisions. I'm becoming more and more convinced that the other demos word that we attend to so much, democracy, is perhaps impossible between 330 million people in this country and maybe on a large scale. The question of scale that your reflections provokes for me is just a deep, ongoing question. At what scale can I really live justly and anticipate living in generation to generation and sustainability? So I'll just shut up there.
Thank you, Jim. I think that you've highlighted things yourself, Ananda, that we'll come back to, because you did in your presentation talk about something that we'll come back to: religious downsizing, in order to relearn what to live like with the ancestors. And I suspect it would link towards the irrational symbol and the form of religious experience that Miguel is referring to. So Miguel, would you like to say something before I then go to the other colleagues who are listening?
I got a couple of thoughts coming from Anna's presentation that I like very much. From the idea of embodiment for bodily. These are not random, but just inspired by what you're saying. First is the observation that in my life, I'm 38 years old. So in my life, there's been another big pandemic that would be HIV. And in that first pandemic, sexual orientation and sexual contact was playing the role that now it's social distancing. So I don't know what it means, but we can think that how this pandemic advanced the bodily control over. The other thing that I thought with Anna, that I was with Anna's presentation that I had in my paper also, that combines the two ideas, rites of passage and body, was and media also, was the first thing, that one of the first reactions to COVID, what this internet meme of the dancing coffin, which is actually a funeral, no? So one of the main reactions, and that got me thinking about one special thing that I think it's in the center of this, that we have the most successful way of communicating in nowadays. It's called viralization. When you go viral on the internet, you go full. But when that form of communication comes to our biological bodies and to our material societies, that's too fast for us. And our health systems are collapsing, for example. So it's also, I think, one key thing to think about, no? How the same type of communication in one aspect is killing us all, and in the other aspect is the way we get success in the internet or whatever. The other thing, apart from biology, that occurs to me with Jim's presentation, which is two things. One is this pantheistic kind of view that James brought, the thing that everything have some kind of a spirit or some form of a spirit. I think what I was trying to say, that it's most from a decolonial perspective, but the idea that in modernity, the separation of secular and religious, it's like the framework for an epistemic kind of view for objects and subjects as polarities, as opposing each other. I think have the same argument that, or respond to the same observation that you're seeing here, that we need to undo that way or that path and reconnect with the spirit or with the consciousness of objects, of everything, and more with, for example, technology, which is very, very much in our lives right now. And the other thing that you say that I also like it is the idea of COVID as a messenger, no? And if we think as the messengers, we're not only thinking about God talking and really great, but also another gods, no? Hermes or Ganesh. So we have a lot of deities that convey this idea of transmission of messenger, and in a lot of ways, it's in this aspect of God talking, in this aspect of being a messenger, that we are thinking mediation, and that we are talking, for example, technology or bodily fluids or corporality. So I think it's very interesting, both presentations, and I'm inspired to keep writing my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. You did ask at the beginning, who is the everyone? And I think that's a question we also need to hold here about pandemos, everyone, and democracy. Who is the everyone? I think there's Kuzipa and there is Benny, colleagues. Before I turn to Sione, do you have any observation or questions you'd like to pose to the panelists before Sione comes in with any question from our attendees? Kuzipa or Benny? And I think Gerald is also
I have two questions, actually. The first one actually is following the trail that Anna has started about this whole emphasis that Miguel put on the rite of passage. So if I'm hearing Jim's paper correctly, there's this kind of transcorporeal emphasis that things are interconnected, things come in and out, humans are not in control. So in that sense that we could be influenced and changed by different encounters. But the rite of passage seems to be so, in a way, it's static, right? It's almost like you're passing through to get to, in your paper, talking about adulthood. So along with Anna asking whether the rite of passage, the liminality can be eternal, I want to ask whether the rite of passage can be repeated over and over again. So it's not just one rite of passage that seems to be communicated from your paper. So that's my first question. The second question that I have is both Jim and Miguel emphasize a lot about the need to downsize and the growth cycle is over in Miguel's written paper. The problem of that is that certainly that is true, but with the coronavirus, we are doing something that is growing, that would be technology, right? We all depend on the internet, and I don't see an end to that. I actually see that there's going to be more and more. So how do we deal with that question that actually Jim also talks about, our dependence on technology as a problem?
Okay, thank you. So, and I will take Kuzipa. Kuzipa, you had something, a question to also ask so that the colleagues can take those questions.
I do not have a question as such, but just to echo something that I think connects with another presentation from yesterday.
Please do.
Regarding the infinite time. I think that there was one presentation around that, and the liminal space. I mean, with all the questions that have now been presented around that. But I see that in the discussions, we are certainly characterizing this period as a time for waiting. And I'm quite fascinated with the linguistic, aspect of having the infinitive verb in its resting position before it acquires a subject, as a way of looking at this space and a way of then, creatively attributing subjectivity, within that space. So I just found it, an interesting connect. And I thought it connects very well to what Miguel says of the experiential side of religion, where you have a more accessible, rather than, esoteric ways of doing theology. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's a good way to connect with what happened to the presentation from yesterday, from Julie yesterday. So can we go back to Benny's question to Miguel, James, and Anna? So I don't know which one would like to go first. Why?
I go. Yeah. I got the liminality. I'm gonna be brief. First of all, I want to thank for the questions. I think rites of passage. I get it. It sounds static, but actually, in anthropology, the structuralists are people who study culture and society from the structures, and rites of passage are actually the way they try to study change. So even though we have a structure like separation, liminarity, aggregation, that's the way that socially we tend to create change or to mark actually cultural trends. So transition is the key aspect there. As the question for liminarity, can liminarity go forever? We wish, I think, because I'm not saying liminarity is a bad thing. I think one part of that irrationality of irrational symbol, we were talking and linking that with the experiential part of religion. I think that what it has in common with liminarity is ambiguity. I think there's a very productive thing to ambiguity, and we have to know that. It's mysterious, like in a lot of theological, mysterious. The funny thing is that ambiguity, and this productive ambiguity, is not only being studied in religion, it's also being studied in neural networks for artificial intelligence, where you get intelligence from algorithms, but you cannot explain it because it's also mysterious. It's also a black box. So what I think it's connected is the idea of this idea of liminarity, and I'm not talking only about a liminarity of a space. I'm also talking about liminarity of social classifications in every aspect of time, of subjectivity, everything. And I think we have to link it with the search for that rational, irrational symbol. And I think one of the key aspects here is that the universality we have in Christianity, that was pretty much linked to science in a pretty funny way, actually, because science got nothing to do with religion, but it has everything to do with religion. We don't have to forget that every scientific paper started with 2020, before Christ or after Christ. So what I'm saying is, I think that what we have to take, to bring back from this pandemic situation, from this liminar situation, it's that idea of irrationality, ambiguity, and in its productive way, in its capabilities not only to be democratic in access, but only to create or to convey social movements and new cultural trends. But obviously, we have to have present that within that ambiguous productivity of liminar spaces and social scenarios, there's also far right and dangers that we have to add. Liminarity, it's not a static place. Liminarity is a challenge. Not all peoples come alive from the rites of passage. And from the growth of economic that also they asking me, yeah, it's very much a draft, my paper. I have to change a lot of things. The last part is one of that. That's it's a work in progress. Take it.
Yeah. Okay, so because we have some questions from the attendees, and I think I want to give that space while we mull over the questions of Benny, and because they're all important, but it's to facilitate the direction both of what you're producing, but also this conversation, which is larger than any piece we're writing. It's because of, it's about lives at stake. So that's important. So Sione.
Thank you. I think there are several questions, but I'm going to group them into three, and I'll try to raise the first two. Several of the questions about the body and body theology. What is the place of this vulnerability of the body? Because the body theology tends to be about centralizing, about the limbonality, to use that term. So there's a way in which that the body is glorified or embraced, centralized, but then now the body is infected, the body is sick. What is the place of, does sickness or ill health have a place in body theology, and how you would respond to that? And the other side of this body question is seeing that there's vulnerability. Yeah, we are at this, the pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of our bodies, and we also are interested in justice. So how do you connect this body theology with the vulnerability of the body and seek to find justice And maybe this is where this disabled body or differently abled body theology may come into conversation with not just the pandemic, but with body theology. So the first cluster of question is about how the complexity of body theology. The second one is, I'll just read it. It's in the chat. COVID may be a piece in Earth's intifada against humanity's capitalist culture. It could humanize our realities or accelerate the efforts of the fourth industrial revolution to further disembody our realities, in which case it will accelerate the disembodying and disfranchising of the working class. Would the panelists like to make a call which way this will go? So you're being put on the spot. Where would we go? Is the body, as Jim has said, is the COVID teaching us something? So let me raise those two questions at this point, Michael.
So Anna, if you can respond to the first part of the question, and then Jim with the second part, and then if there are any insights from Miguel, we bring that in there. So Anna?
All right, sure. The whole question of the complexity of body theology and how does sickness play itself into a body theology. I think a lot of times the theology of the body, which of course is very strongly patriarchal, and there's certain bodies that are what bodies are, and then everything else that's different becomes sort of unbodied, I guess you would say. So perhaps the space that we're in now, where we have to treat with infected and sick bodies, unhealthy bodies, dying bodies, dead bodies, is a space for us to recognize the complexity of what it means to be embodied, such that all the different ways of experiencing being embodied are included in the experience of a body theology. So there's no lesser of a body because it's a sick body or it's a differently abled body or so on. So I agree that there is a space for us now in thinking through and crafting or recrafting a body theology that we take into account all of these different ways of being embodied. And key to all of that, I think, is concern with vulnerability, this concern with fragility, which is definitely a part of what it, in fact, is a key part of what it means to be embodied, that we recognize our fragility, we recognize our fallibility, we recognize our vulnerability. That's one part of understanding vulnerability, but I also want to go back to the concern that I have with vulnerabilities that are crafted or created vulnerabilities, such as the ones that COVID is currently exploiting. So that for me is the challenge that's rubbing up against complexifying a body theology such that our fragility or natural sort of human vulnerabilities are taken account of, while recognizing that they rub up against and come into conflict with the way that we read these different ways of being embodied, such that they're given different and differing values. And then we enter spaces of continued and continual injustice. So that, that would be what I'd be thinking about at the moment.
Okay, and James, as quickly as possible. Sorry.
Sure. I would just say this. I try to walk on two legs, one of which is committed to responding to the pain of the emergency of the hour, whatever it is, to be involved. The other one of which is trying to stay plugged into the much bigger questions like climate change, like the last 5,000 years of civilizational development and technology. And in relationship to that latter one, to be really candid, I think it looks very bleak. I think many societies are possessed anymore of a kind of techno-fundamentalism, where the only answer is what kind of control mechanism can we come up with to respond to whatever the crisis of the hour is. But it's heading us into, I think, a deeply dystopian society. Here in Detroit, facial recognition technology is now being deployed in relationship to inner city businesses that disproportionately targets people of color. The Uyghurs in China effectively have been rendered the western part of China becoming an outdoor prison for them, which I think is probably where we're all headed. And then surveillance capitalism is being articulated by Shoshana Zuboff, the way we're being fed our own deepest desires through algorithmic responses that are remaking us in the image of the corporation without us even knowing it. And, you know, it could go into the military side of this as well, and drone technology being able to wipe out particular kinds of people depending on how it's programmed with software. I am more and more Luddite the older I get, wanting to have us stop enslaving matter, listen to indigenous folk who had a much more respectful relationship with the non-human world, in the hopes that maybe we can learn enough to survive and not go extinct.
Thank you, Jim. I think there's another question, and it's specifically from Miguel. So, Sione, can you ask that question?
Thank you, Miguel. And this is a question directed at Miguel, but I think it's a question that applies to all of us. It has to do with liberation theology. And liberation theology started with its attention to the poor. There's a class element at the very beginning, and that class element has to do with economy. COVID has broken that economic system down. So what shall liberation theology do to revive itself in terms of the economic, in terms of the class struggles of our time? I'm rephrasing this question.
No, okay.
That's it.
I don't think I totally agree with the question, in the sense that I don't think that COVID had totally reshaped that economic production system. I think that what we're seeing with the technology we're using right now, Zoom, or and the way it suddenly was prepared for this type of a scenario, it's not only having an economic distribution enhanced at the 1%. A lot of companies are making a lot of money of being under lockdown. No way, no doubt about it. But what I think it's a good question about liberation theology, at least from, you know, in my university, we used to have like, my professors were old liberation theologists, kind of activists. And so we have a lot of feedback from them. And I think class is not a concept that is isolated. Class is what, like I said, linked with race. There's a racialization of class. And I think both race and both class are coming from categories that come from religious discourse. Before modernity, we can say before the beginning of the 20th century, they talk populations that talk about the Gentiles or the Jewish population, and that categories transform when biopower came into class and race. So I think those categories are matched together, and I think there's also this what we're talking about, embodiment in here, no? Not only with race, but with technology also. I think I like the idea that technology, and I mean every technology, language is a technology also. It's an expansion of our bodies. And you know, that's how the Bible starts, no? The verb came to be flesh. So there's an interconnection between our technologies or culture itself and our bodies. So what I'm surprised in my previous media experience in their conference is how there's no theologians writing code, how there's no an involvement much more aggressive of bringing Christian thought or Christian theology even in code form. In like we still have this modern kind of conservative kind of looking at the technology that I know technology, it's like a product of a system of inequalities, but we are not changing that just for pointing it and criticizing, and we have to engage with that. That's my idea of how a liberation theology should move forward.
Thank you very much, because I think that we can continue this conversation, but we do have to listen to our poet and have this benediction, and our time is drawing to a close. And I like to assure colleagues who have asked questions, some of these questions are very important because it's helpful with regard to the colleagues who are writing their papers, but also it then helps us as people who are reflecting back to frame our own kind of understanding of what is before us and the different ways in which churches and ecclesial communities and religious communities and us as human beings are asked and called upon to respond, and to respond in a way that can affirm the collective goodness that all of us embody towards something transformative and transforming. As Karen prepares, I would just like to say that we're going to end after the benediction. So after the benediction, there a slight pause and then we end. So I'd like to thank you, the speakers. I'd like to thank all the colleagues who have contributed around this panel group, and also the attendees, the questions you have asked. It's very important. Your presence here is affirming. And I'd like to reiterate that the Africa and Europe webinars will continue at the same time tomorrow, November the 1st, with presentations from Wanda Defelt and Tinyiko Maluleki. So please join us, because we're looking forward to a robust conversation there as well. And also please note the other eDARE webinars for Asia and Pacifica, the Caribbean and the Americas. If you're able, please join in and engage in the conversation. There will be some evaluation questions, and we'd like to encourage you to have a go, because we know that you don't have much to do. So please have a go trying these evaluation questions. So thank you. Over to you, Karen, Georgia.
Thank you, Michael. Today's poem I've been writing daily, listening to the panelists and doing this moment of benediction as a theological reflection on what we've heard. And today's poem is entitled For Everyone, and that's with a question mark. Writing a new script, inviting the impossible in a world ravaged and changed by diseases. No place safe, no bodies sacred, brothels, beaches, and bodies isolated and ignored, all closed because of uprising and upheaval. Bodies shut down by inequalities, gender, race, and economy exposed, attacking the body in every form, disproportionately engaged in an ill-timed assault, ravaging human bodies, redefining institutional bodies, changing the body of Christ as we know it. Whose world is emerging? Transforming environments, bringing unscripted change. What to make of this disease? What is the message we hear from this pandemic monstrosity? What are we willing to grieve? This COVID-19, with its myriad of complexities, brings with it death of body, mind, and spirit. Body count soaring as the days go by, dead bodies rejected, identified as feared, as they too are terrorized. Missing rituals of closure, their spirits still journey on, absent of funerals and mourning. Whose new world are we seeking? Immoral, redefined, families left unprotected, criminalized, racialized, and problematized. Marginalized bodies charged to bear more harm and pain. Justice is yet evasive on their behalf. Vulnerabilities of lives ostracized by unjust social conditions. COVID-19, one more threat to lives inhabited, bodies demonized. What is the message brought into our midst? What is the message brought by the falling? Falling bodies, falling angels, falling morals, falling empathy, falling gods. Whose new world are we imagining? No safe zone to be found in the world, we continue to listen for active resistance to the problems of life exposed. What do we want to see socially realized? Knowing that the poor are expendable, indigenous, Black and brown bodies do not matter, economies and empires continuing to thrive. Infections reveal systemic vulnerability, upending global economies, toppling multinational monstrosities, diminishing principalities and powers. There is a message from the other side, questions that come before discussions of eternal life and the mystery of the afterlife. Whose new world is fashioned by this messenger? What is the message brought into our midst? What is the message brought by this virus? Exposing the powers of evil, displaying the powers of patriarchy, identifying the powers of colonialism, pointing out the powers of imperialism, uncovering the powers of transnational parasites. Whose new world is being defined by this liminality? There is potential, there are possibilities. New worlds are possible among the living. Rites of passage identified to be explored, relocating ourselves in the symbols of deeper meaning. We emerge changed, moved to deeper spiritual living. Whose new world is problematized, navigating away from uncaring societies? Whose new world is redefined in this battle for sustainable economies? Whose new world is transformed in seeking to receive suffering in the streets? Whose new world is emerging? Ashe.